Our webinar series is just one of the many ways in which HACSA Foundation strives to celebrate African heritage and culture, reunite the African diaspora, and create platforms for serious debate on how Africa can develop its own narratives. Each panelist will introduce themselves. We have a really exciting panel here today. Their breadth of knowledge and experience make them excellent resources to dissect conflicts and often misunderstood relationship between Africans and African Americans. Let us begin with a question to all the panelists. What's the relationship between Africans and African Americans in the US? How do you think African Americans view Africans and vice versa? And does African privilege really exist in America? We shall start with a lady who has written extensively on these issues. You can follow her on LinkedIn. And so if we, Osei-Mensah, kindly introduce yourself, tell us what you do, and give us your take on the questions that have been posed.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for the kind introduction. My name is Osei-Mensah, and I'm a business application solutions specialist. I know that's a long title at Microsoft, but essentially what I do is I partner with our enterprise customers to transform their businesses and improve their bottom line through technology. And I was born and raised in Ghana. I moved to the United States for college and have lived here for the past 15 years. I currently live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area with my family, but essentially I've always been very passionate about telling accurate, multifaceted stories about Africa and Africans, and I began writing on this topic about a decade ago for my undergraduate thesis when I talked about the image of Africa on screen, and I compared two films, that one African-based and the other Western-based. Recently, I began writing again, fueled by worldwide cries for justice, racial justice, and my personal experience as an African immigrant living in the United States. So I'm really committed to using my written voice to foster, unity across the African diaspora in our collective fight against racism. And as Ambassador mentioned, I recently authored some articles that talk specifically about this relationship between African Americans and Africans in the diaspora. To answer the question on the floor, I would say that the relationship between Africans and African Americans has evolved over time. It's still partly tenuous, I would say. It's improved, but partly tenuous, and I'd like to explain what I mean by that. So on one hand, from the African side, what is our impression of African Americans? Growing up in Africa, I felt like we saw African Americans as the epitome of cool. Yeah, we were very, especially as teenagers, we were very taking with your swag, as we called it, their accents, their sometimes lighter skin and wavier hair, their prowess in music and sports. Those were the stereotypes that we knew about as teenagers in Africa, and we were completely flawed by those. On the other hand, as Africans, some of us on our way to America, we saw African Americans, I think, as a bit of a guilty pleasure. And what I mean by that is we really liked them, but we were coached by our elders to be wary of them, especially on our way to America, and to make sure that we wouldn't fall into the stereotypes that we knew about them. So stereotypes, unfortunately, of crime, poverty, malice. We were asked to be wary of that, honestly. On the African American side, from what I perceive as an African, I think that there's a deeper admiration for authentic African culture, for our fabrics, our music, our rich heritage, and I think our proximity to our mutual roots. There's a deeper admiration for the fact that we're so close to our rich culture. On the other hand, I've also detected a bit of a disdain for our perceived aloofness, and the fact that African Americans often see Africans as thinking too good of themselves, or also African Americans sometimes, unfortunately, also buy into the stereotypes of Africans, where we are seen as primitive, poor, and wise, sick. And so I've heard from a lot of African Americans here when they ask certain questions about life in Africa and see through those questions, those biases. So finally, to your question about African privilege, do I think it exists in America? Absolutely. And I write about that in my article. I know that it sounds oxymoronic, having Africa and privilege in the same sentence, but I do think that there's a trauma to generations of psyche of African Americans, from slavery to Jim Crow to the continued systemic racism and police brutality. And that's something that we just didn't grow up with. So even if you're an African living in America, you have the privilege of not having to have grown up in a society where you were judged primarily for your skin color, and that your life outcomes many times were boxed into the category of skin. So in that sense, I absolutely think we do have privilege.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ehui. Ehui has written extensively on this topic, and I urge you to look up her very, very insightful articles. I, feel that African privilege is not an oxymoron whatsoever. I think Africans in the US experience this every day, and indeed, sometimes people would react when Africans open their mouth and say, "Oh, you're foreign," or you're English, or you speak English, or something like that. So I think it's important that we delve deeper into this area, and I'd like to pass on to Judge McCullough. Judge, could you kindly introduce yourself, tell us what you do, where you come from, and address the issues which have been raised? Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. Ambassador, thank you for the invitation. To the technical team that's working to make this happen, thank you all. And for those family members that are on the link, we appreciate your support. So my name is Leroy McCullough. I happen to be one of 55 Superior Court judges here in King County, state of Washington, the United States. Have been a judge since 1989. So this is, I'm approaching 30 years and ready to retire as soon as I win the lottery or something like that. It's an awesome privilege. I have spent many of those years working with juveniles, working with families, doing criminal law as well as business. So it's an incredible opportunity that I have to be with each and every one of you. The question before us, it was whether or not there's a certain relationship between Africans and African Americans. I identify myself as an African born in America. We are separated simply by zip code, by culture, and by a body of water. But it doesn't necessarily separate me from my family members, some of whom are on the line, who were born in Ghana. I do believe that, as the previous speaker has said, it is a complex relationship. There is one of suspicion, there's distrust, there's resentment in some places, but it's also a relationship that I think that is brimming with extraordinary possibilities. What do I mean by suspicion? The previous speaker indicated that there were stereotypes on both sides, and I'm going to call it of the water, and that is absolutely true. Africans born in America or African Americans have been led to believe that many of the Africans who immigrate here have a certain image of African Americans, and I'm glad to hear, Huey, that it was positive as far as the swag. I like that influenced me, but there's also some of the negative imagery about the crime and about the violence and about the laziness and all of that. And occasionally, there are brothers and sisters from the continent who will get here, and they are quite surprised to see the level of industriousness, level of achievement, the level of economic accomplishments that are here, that Africans born and reared in America have made in spite of the enslavement, in spite of the Jim Crow, and so forth. So part of what I like to do, including with my sons and my daughters, from wherever they're from, I want to make sure that all of my children, wherever they were born, whatever the zip code is, know about the HBCUs and the accomplishments, the 200 Black universities that are here in this country that have educated engineers, doctors, lawyers for centuries. The privilege question. I do believe that white America, Europeans, enjoy separating our family. So the privilege is one way to keep us as family from being united. So if I favor one child versus the other, that keeps the children apart rather than telling them that we're all part of the same family. So the privilege often is accorded any immigrant as long as you're not Black and as long as you're not born and reared in America. So if you have a different speech pattern, if it appears that you came from someplace else, it's their job to make you feel like not only are you different, but you're better. Then the reality sinks in. If they don't know where you're from, you will get treated just like the rest of us. And in preparation for this, I wanted to remind people about a young man by the name of Amadou Diallo. So some of you know that it was February 4th, 1999, that this young man from Guinea was shot by the New York police officers in front of his apartment. There were 41 shots, 19 hit him, and they were charged with second-degree murder. 4 officers, all of whom were found to be not guilty. They didn't have time to find out what he sounded like, where he was from. They saw the melanin, they saw where he was standing, and they made the assumption that he was family and he was treated so badly. Interestingly enough, they did have a lawsuit that settled for $3 million. So there's that privilege, but there's also the cold shot from time to time that we're all in this together. I think that's about it for now. From my perspective, my view, our view of Africans in the continent, we find, my family members and I, that it's wonderful heritage. Many of us want to embrace it. We just haven't been taught. And again, those persons that are in charge of the educational systems and the cultural systems do not want us to know about Africans in Africa, and they don't want Africans in Africa to know about African Americans that are here. So I am delighted that HACSA is doing the work that it's doing. For all of you that are joining hands in this collective effort, thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge McCullough. We really appreciate your contribution. And we would now like to go to the distinguished Perez Owino. She's an actor, a director, and a filmmaker. And I would appreciate it if she introduced herself and told us a little bit about her film before moving to answer the question, which is actually the topic of her film. So in the end, they are one and the same. Thank you, Perez. Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate these forums. I really appreciate, because I really do believe that our ancestors have really put us in this place so we can bridge this gap. And that is specifically the reason I made Bound Africans versus African Americans, which was a film that highlighted this little known tension that existed between us. But what was more important for me was not necessarily to also highlight that tension, but to also inform each other. I don't know how many of you have watched the film, but to inform each other of each other's narratives, so that we start very briefly with what the tension is, and we have a group of Africans and African Americans doing a roundtable, and then we go into the history of the African experience, the history of the African American experience, and then the unified Black experience, and then what comes after it. I think that was, and one of the reasons we made that film was we just didn't want it to go into the festivals and be sold somewhere and exist on like Amazon or iTunes. We really wanted a film that could go into the school systems where African and African Americans have their first contact, and there in which we can evoke the change, because that was my narrative. That was how I was first introduced to African Americans, was in a university campus when I met this African American man who I thought was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. And I really wanted to get his phone number. And I asked him erroneously, because of my assumption, being an African, I asked him, where in Africa are you from? And he looked at me and he said, I'm from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and you people sold us. And that was really the beginning of Bound for me. Was I'd never had that narrative of this idea that the Africans did sell off the African Americans. And that started me on this journey of bridge building, of getting the diaspora back together again. I mean, I know it's been 400, 500 years, but I don't think that, I've always find it interesting that the melanin remains. So it is easy for me to pick you out in a crowd because the melanin remains. But I wanted to say something about African privilege. And I'm really grateful for what the judge said, because I think that is really key and important, because we have to remember that the African is privileged in America, but the African American is privileged in Europe. The African is not. So that there is this division that is constantly put in there to let us know your place. Oh, you've come really far enough. We don't see enough of you here, so you're unique in America, so you're good. But we see too much of you in Europe. So when the African American comes, oh, you're not this Black that we're used to, you're this other Black. And I feel like there's almost, I don't know if I would call it privilege as much as I would call it like a Jedi mind trick to get us to keep ourselves separated. And I almost also feel like, especially speaking as an African, I feel like also there's like a little bit of an underlying, I call it like the Stockholm syndrome, where when we look at how we judge each other, when we look at how Africans judge African Americans or African Americans judge Africans, who defined civilization? It wasn't us. Who defined what was good? Who defined what was bad? It wasn't us. So we're using other people's metrics to define each other. And that in there lies a very fundamental problem. And sometimes I will counter African Americans who are trying to remember things that Africans are trying to forget. For example, spirituality and religion. And so that I think at some point, I always tell people that we have to get to the place where whiteness is not the sun upon which our Blackness rotates. We have to pull ourselves from that to figure out who we are. And that was really the intention of Bound. We were trying to figure out who we are as the diaspora, how to find each other, and how to recreate what was lost, and how to create something with what we have gained. And so yeah, that's really all I wanted to say.
That's a lot.
That was a lot. Some really nice analogies in there, which hopefully we can pick out later on. So I'll move now to Duane Hughes. Duane, the debate has started and it's wide open. And so kindly introduce yourself, tell us what you do and where you are, and tell us what you think about this situation of African American versus African.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I appreciate it. And Judge, and hopefully I'm getting it, Ehui and Perez, Judge, it's an honor to be on this panel with you today. So I am also a proud graduate of Howard University, as was my mother and many of my uncles, absolutely. So I got the HBCU thing in the house. So I'm just going to tell you, so let me see, I was a lawyer for 20 years, then I went into business. I'm a Wall Street, New York guy, big law firms, and then Morgan Stanley for a long time, and then JP Morgan. And now I've been working for 30 years. I've dedicated myself full time after a long time as a broker dealer and securities lawyer and business person of private wealth to becoming a diversity and inclusion client-facing person at a large law firm in the United States. Been around the world, studied in London for a year where I had my most initial really introduction to West Africans in the diaspora, Ghanaians and Nigerians, and they were very welcoming to me when I studied at the London School of Economics in college. And then I've just been honored to have found love the second time in my life after I lost my wife to cancer 5 to 6 years ago. And I fell in love this time around with a Ghanaian. And I have since really had the honor of discovering Ghana really through her eyes, and having been to Ghana twice in the last 3 years. So that's my background and my orientation. I trace my roots. Thank you very much. I trace my roots back to the 1830s to the Thomas Jefferson plantation in Monticello. On my dad's side, Wormley Hughes was the farmer for Thomas Jefferson. And if you go there now, you'll see an enactment of Wormley Hughes, who's my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And then on my mom's side, to a plantation in Edgefield, South Carolina in the 1830s. So I'm maybe one of the, I'm not gonna say few, but it's somewhat unusual to be an African-American and literally be able to trace your roots on both sides of your family to the plantation you came from. So I consider myself an African-American. Actually, my birth certificate, my brother in 1964 said Negro, and then in the 60s became Black, and now we have African-American. But I look at myself as going back, 200 years on each side of my family in that regard. And so that, in that sense, I come from a tradition, if there is such a thing, as an African-American descendant of slaves in the United States to this conversation. And let me say this conversation has been a wonderful setup from everyone who's gone before us, and frankly, very sophisticated in my view. I love the last point about the indicia of how it's different if you're an immigrant, an African-American in Europe versus an African here. And I think that tracks along with that privilege and that accent, and if you will, putting this in the global context is the most useful, because we can get lost in a very particular American experience and a sort of white supremacy construct within the United States, and in this conversation lose out on the global picture of what it's like to be a member of the diaspora anywhere in the world, and to be either part of the dominant culture, part of the traditional subservient culture, and an immigrant there too. And I think that's a big part of the dynamic in terms of where you stand, in terms of your experience and perhaps perception, is if you are part of the, the people who've been here for a very long time, and the dominant culture had a very specific way of subjugating you, then you're going to be depressed and unfortunately brainwashed because of the dozens to hundreds of years of purposeful re-scripting of your mind to think of yourself as lesser than. Some would call this internalized racism. Right? Whereas if you're an immigrant coming from another place, then you have the chance to not have participated in that brainwashing, in that programming, and you naturally, as an immigrant of whatever race, then are learning the United States from whatever perspective you came from, and then you have to sort through the messages of the land in which you arrived. And here in the United States, that means Black Americans are less than, they tend to be criminals, they tend to be lazy, and all these other stereotypes. So, and then what happens there is just all this individual variation, I would say, depends on your intellectual curiosity. Like, the more curious you are as an individual, maybe in your family history or others, the more educated you are, in quotes. I think curiosity is probably more important than formal education. Then the more you answer some of these questions for yourself, and you can try to rise above these stereotypes and this negative programming. So I think that reinforces everything. The only other thing I would sort of add is I think it's important to recognize the legitimacy of a similar to me preference. And that is that we as human beings naturally are gravitated to people who look like, sound like people we've grown up with. And in the stereotypical course of things, if you're a heterosexual male, you'll be attracted to your mom more so. If you're a woman, to your dad, how they talk, how they smell, how tall they are, their mannerisms and the like. And so what happens is you have a natural tendency then to replicate that similar to me preference wherever you go. right? The more intellectually curious you are, perhaps the wider your preferences. And so I say that to say that even in the most natural course of things, you would find different cultures tend to gravitate to their people who are like themselves, not on a totally exclusive basis, but to a significant extent. So as a Black American, and you're here, and the Nigerians are coming over and being very successful, the Ghanaians are coming over, they're being very successful, they're lauded by the societies like, look at what these immigrants are doing. Why can't you Black Americans do the same thing? And these are groups of people who sort of really tightly network and help each other. Whereas African Americans, we've been like brainwashed into this divide and conquer strategy that the judge has mentioned. And it's like not an apt comparison from any perspective when you're dealing with an immigrant population versus some of a native population. One could allow oneself to then participate in the type of divisions that would then be self-defeating. And I do agree with this idea of not like defining yourself either by comparison to white people or some other dominant culture, but trying to find your own absolute value of comparison. So I think that's sort of fraught with some of the fragmentation that you'd see. The last thing I'll just end, and I'll end with this, is a story really from my grandparents. And my my parents, and they're in their 80s, they sort of had this perception when they came around that Africans who came from Africa over here really thought that they were better than the African Americans. Because, you know, usually, at least in their realms, they were more educated who came in. There's a class element that's very significant. And these people who they had perception with from afar didn't integrate necessarily or, you know, try to reach out and build the bridge. And, you know, some of that information is somewhat dated. But I sort of point out to my parents that everyone needs to realize that we all have these preferences to be around people similar to ourselves, and people who come from different places, you know, want to really huddle and help each other. Like you'll see Black Americans mainly associated with other Black Americans in Europe as well. And sort of these integrations sort of happen over time. I do think that, and finally, is that we have a substantial opportunity as society has progressed and there's greater and greater sort of international curiosity among us, both sides of the pond, if you will, to participate in increasing levels of understanding, information, education, enlightenment, such that we form ourselves as a one coherent culture and put ourselves in the path of opportunity and demonstrate that we, as from the African diaspora, should consider ourselves, everything else held equal, as a first choice and not just an also. Right, and therefore, you know, we will only get respect, if you will, as a larger tribe, to the extent that we help each other, right? Because I do think there's a substantial amount of tribal behavior, tribal not in the traditional sense of tribe, but social group, I should say, behavior, and how groups are become successful. They help each other, share resources, and prefer each other, everything else held equal. Thank you for your attention.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Duane, for that passionate contribution. And since it's a town hall and we are, our time is fast spent, I'd like to open the floor for any questions. I do have follow-up questions myself, so I'm going to put them out there. And then when you answer, you can just pick and choose which questions you want to answer, and we can come back to them if they don't get answered at the end, if there's still more time. So from the point of view of Ehui's contribution, my question is the lack of empathy for the situation of African Americans by African communities. Does that change then when they have children and there's no distinction between their children and the children of African Americans? Because then suddenly the whole Black Lives Matter issue is right in their face when their children are speaking with an African American accent and don't distinguish themselves as different from African Americans. The second is to Judge McCullough. We discussed earlier on about African privilege, and I'm wondering whether this applies in courtrooms as well. So do we have a situation where maybe white judges would be more lenient on an African immigrant rather than an African American. We would appreciate your views on that. From the point of view of Perez, she brought up something really interesting. The fact that African Americans are fated in Europe, and I know especially in France, they have a lot of affair with African Americans. Is it also because of their role in the entertainment industry? You know, the fact that we have the narratives out of Africa being about poverty and disease, but the narratives coming out from America and the African American community that they are cool and they are sports people, they do music, and people want to imbibe that culture and so have a more favorable view of them because, of course, they have marketing machines or machineries behind them. And finally, to Duane, I'd like you to tell us more about the movement in the US, which acknowledges that African Americans who are descendants of enslaved people are a separate group and should be given different treatment when it comes to affirmative action and government structures or government schemes to in some way give reparations for slavery through affirmative action, because that's, in my view, the way you can look at affirmative action as a form of reparations. And in fact, that idea I got for the first time from an African American who lives in Rhode Island. Yeah, so those are my questions, but I'll open up the floor. If anyone has any other questions they'd like to put into the debate, we'll take them, and then, like I said, the panelists can pick and choose what to answer.
I'll attempt to answer the first question that you raised, Ambassador, about how your perspective changes when you start having kids. And I feel very strongly about that because that's precisely when my awareness began. So I went from being this young African immigrant who had these unfortunate stereotypes and of African Americans to a mother of two Black girls who are completely African American. And one time I had my daughter, who was just 4 years old, as I mentioned in my article, have a little quarrel with one of her little friends. And this was a little white boy, and she came to me and she asked me if she was being badly treated by him because she was brown. And this was when she was 4, she's 7 now. And I was so taken aback and shocked that she even had the concept of being brown, because I certainly didn't at that age. And so then I suddenly realized that we were going to start having to have conversations about race much earlier than I was prepared for. And then I saw the difference in demands of parenting a Black child in Africa versus America. I mentioned how my parents never had to think about exposing us to folks that looked like us, or having the conversation about being safe, and having the conversation about interacting with the police or interacting with different races of children. But now I'm having to do that and do it quickly and find the right words and situation to raise my kids to be confident in themselves and tolerant of all races. So that certainly threw me in the deep end and helped me realize my privilege, as I was mentioning earlier, and helped me realize that when it comes to your skin color in America, like the judge mentioned, after a while, or if they don't get to talk with you, you are just as Black as everybody else. And you will also get shot or will also get poorly treated before they realize what kind of Black you are. So yes, yeah.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else want to join into the debate?
Are you all speaking in regards to answering that question or just picking any of the other questions?
Pick a question, girl. Whatever you got.
Okay, I am ready for this one. France and the African American, America and the African. This is my theory. On the surface, it may look like, oh, we love them because they can play basketball. Oh, we love them, they can play music. I think underneath, it depends on who is close to reflecting your whiteness back to you, the trauma that you inflicted. I feel the French do not want to look at the Senegalese because the Senegalese reminds you of the stuff you done and you don't want to look at that. So you'd much rather look at the African American. Then you can point at America and tell America you have a race problem. And then vice versa. You have the African and you say, well, the African is developing in America. I don't understand what this race issue is. Of course not, because you don't want to look at the African American. You don't even want to accept that slavery happened. You're calling them now endangered. You're calling them migrant labor because it's going to force you to look at yourself and what your history holds and what your people did. And you don't want to do that. And so you move away from that because that's too sensitive, that's too traumatic. But I'm going to love this safer black. Because this, when I love this black, I don't see my ugliness. That's what that is. I don't think, I mean, I love James Baldwin and everybody, and he's a phenomenal writer. I don't think people are thinking that deep. Because when you watch James Baldwin sitting in the halls of Cambridge or Oxford or whatever it wasn't they're talking about is the American dream. Seriously, is the American dream lost because the Negro, because of the Negro's plight? Britain, you're colonizing and you're raping the world on that other side. What is this?
Yeah.
What is this? Cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
What is this?
Yeah.
You know? And I just want to add here that we also have to remember as the diaspora that the 50s and 60s was such a pivotal moment. And I think sometimes we don't take a moment to just look at that as the diaspora. I mean, I know we look at it as African Americans and civil rights. We look at it in Africa as colonialism falling apart. But we never pay attention to how W.E.B. Du Bois, all of these African Americans were struggling for Africa. And all of these Africans were in the United Nations struggling for Black Americans. We don't pay attention to why is it that colonialism started to fall in Africa in 63, 64, 65? Why were the civil rights signed in 64, 65? What was going on in that moment? There was a unity of struggle.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. That is really important because when we come together, even Barack Obama came because of Pan-Africanism. Look at what happens. There's a unity of struggle. And that is the thing that is being pushed apart. Is because imagine if the most wealthy continent, the wealthiest continent, found its children and everybody came back and said, okay, let's build this right here, right now. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Things will start to shift. Mm-hmm. That's my take.
No, agreed.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that passionate intervention. Does anyone else want to join that?
I think I want to join that. I am C. Dale Gadsden. I'm African American. Both my parents are from, and myself, we're all from what they call the Sea Islands, so off the coast of South Carolina. So we trace our whole lineage back to the Sea Islands. We are the rice growers and the basket weavers. I'm sorry, we sew baskets and weave fishing nets. And so I'm also an academic. So I teach at the college level, and I also teach high school, and I teach at the graduate level. And I'm an Americanist by title, which means I teach anything in the United States, especially. So I do African American history as a part of everything that I teach. And one of the things I want to say is, while we've talked about the connection between Africans and African Americans, we didn't actually really talk about it very much about what it looks like on campus. And that's the place where we see the most interaction at this point is on college campuses, because you keep getting people coming over for their education. And that's why I saw it blow up the worst. It got so contentious, particularly on the Ivy League campuses. It's blowing up again now, but it got very contentious in the late 90s, early 2000s, to the extent that on one Ivy League campus, the African Americans started calling themselves the descendants. as opposed to calling themselves African or African American. And that's because the Africans' push was, you all are lazy and stupid, and that's why we're here and taking advantage of this. And some Africans went as far as to say, well, my people sold y'all. So so get over it. And so it got incredibly contentious. And even now in the classroom, I have to really manage that relationship really clearly. And the other side of that is not many Africans really spend a lot of time taking African American studies courses. So they don't get the history and they don't get the understanding that they walk in what we call, they walk in our blood. Meaning we bled to have these universities accept more and more African people who look like us. Okay, and I guess around 86, the elite universities decided to switch their admissions processes so that they take in more Black people who are not African American. So they go to the Caribbean, they go to Africa, and they have a very small African American population.
Yes.
And that has created rifts on these campuses. And in fact, I'm in the middle of trying to bridge one of those on my undergraduate campus now, trying to bridge that, trying to help them bridge that. But the Africans and the Caribbean students are actually coming here with ideas about African Americans that actually reflect white people's understanding.
Yeah.
They're coming with that, which means they are learning that at home. They're not learning that when they get here. They're learning that at home. And what is going on that's what they come here with? You know, how do we begin to help? And again, they're not taking my classes. They're not taking African American studies classes for the most part. You know, they're coming here, I'm going into medicine, so I'm just going to take my science classes and I'm going to take these other classes I have to take, but generally I don't have to take an African American studies class. But they benefit from all of the things that are on campus that are geared towards African Americans or Black students, but they aren't necessarily attempting to bridge that. And so that's something I think that as a group, we all need to work on, because it's really important to think about. Those are, you know, some of those students go home. They don't stay in the US. They go back to their home countries. And what are they taking back with them? What are they now? What is the image that's going over back to the continent with them? And so I'm spending a lot of time, like I run the Black Alumni Society. I just created it and I run it now. And we're going to start having our meetings on the continent, just so that we can then start to bridge that. We're going to be going out to the Caribbean just so that we can begin to sort of see everybody in their home structures, and not just in the US context. But somehow we've got to figure out what's happening with the educational systems in other countries that Africans come over here with some deep-seated anti-African American understandings. And that's not, again, not awesome, but
that's a very, very useful contribution and giving us a new perspective on the subject. I'd like to bring Duane in here to mirror what you're saying in terms of the corporate world and on Wall Street, whether we see similar patterns, and also referring back to my original question as well to Duane.
Sure. No, happy to sort of chime in here. I guess, should I call you Dale or Professor Gadsden, or?
Dale is good. Dale is
Dale, good. Fine. No, I underscore what Dale has said. I think it's very, I appreciate you for bringing in the campus. I do think, even when we went around the room here, many of the African immigrants here do come here for college. So that's at least, I mean, class is heavily involved, but I think that's a really relevant point. And then what you end up seeing in Wall Street then is a disproportionate, and by the way, I would put many of the Blacks from Caribbean in a similar category. There's a disproportionate number of Blacks. When you get a group of Blacks of, let's say, 30 Blacks professionals random on Wall Street, like they're just a handful who have more than one generation in the country. So literally most of my best friends they're all my lawyers, because I run deep in Black lawyers on New York, Haitian, Jamaican, Nigerian, Ghanaian, and like one of them goes back in Mississippi out of 10. Right. So what happens is that pattern that you've described, Dale, then reflects itself at all levels of professional society, you know, at least within sort of microcosm. So I see that. But these are folks, though, all of them who very much identify with the Black experience, sort of by definition, right? It's a similar to me preference. I tend to attract people in my world that identify with being Black, even though we have these sort of different histories. And it's interesting, it's changed a lot over time because the way, and I guess I'd also have to say that, again, class has a lot to do with it. Intellectual curiosity and family history has a lot to do with it as well. And this concept of the immigrant story, if you're an immigrant with an I or an E, depending on whether you're from somewhere coming or if you're Black American in France, I think all of those dynamics sort of do, you know, inform us. Let me get to the point, though, that Ambassador mentioned earlier was this concept of American descendants of slaves. And Dale, you actually mentioned it. And people start calling themselves the descendants, you know, to make the distinction. Yeah, there's a feeling that, and you know, again, this is sort of the poverty of the language that we use and the suspiciousness of race-based classifications to start with, right? Because it's a very crude way of dividing people by their race. And so you sort of have the bad of that, which is you take, it's sort of like, you've heard the phrase, if I have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So if everybody's Black and you bunch them into sort of a group, then you start counting by skin color, then Blacks of any background who come to the United States are equally counted. And so all of a sudden people are saying, oh, society's better. Look at how many Blacks are running corporate America. And you go behind the peel, and a disproportionate number of them came here for college and moved on. They're not homegrown, if you will. And so what happens is the people who are homegrown are like, that doesn't count. Very much like the Dominicans and the Puerto Ricans might feel about the Argentines, the you know, fair-skinned Colombians, and others who don't have the same story as the Dominicans and the Puerto Ricans. In particular, the Puerto Ricans who've been here for generations, but yet they're all Hispanic, right? You still have that same problem of, I have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and then you start counting and grouping people in the aggregates when people are saying, well, that's really not the same thing. This is not, they may even add, this is not to take away anything from the success of these brothers and sisters who earn their place in society, but to count them the same as someone who's been here for 7 generations and suffered in this country, it's not the same, right? And so that's where you say, count me as a descendant, acknowledge me for who I am, and don't try to take credit for my brothers and sisters who may have achieved their own success, but come from a different perspective. And then the same thing should be true vice versa, right? If we are the immigrant, like, 'cause by definition, at least in the last, let's say 30, 40, 50 years, most of the college level immigration is by choice, right? It's not, and so it's usually the more enterprising, the more, the higher level of energy, intellectual curiosity, strivers who leave their country and come. So the immigrants are already a self-selected group of people who tend to perform better than their compatriots at home. And so I think that what the sort of descendants are sort of arguing is like, look, if you're going to give reparations, you know, it's not just because you're Black. You need to show some descendancy. Or, you know, and then of course there's extreme arguments that leads to these types of racial purity type claims that can be the extreme. That's like the flip side of any race-based, you know, classification, which is inherently suspicious, right? So I prefer, when I'm talking to clients and others, I try to steer the conversation, unless I'm talking about like government policy and discrimination, I try to steer the conversation to culture a little bit more so, to dominant culture, or to what's most useful, in-group, out-group dynamics. Because the concept of being in an in-group versus being in an out-group is something that's universally applicable, and then we can use that model to have this conversation. And then you can realize that you're an in-group for certain purposes and an out-group for others. Thank you, I appreciate the time.
Brilliant, thank you, Duane. Do we have any other question or comment from the audience? And if not, we can go to Judge McCullough. I am curious, you spoke about having family in Ghana. So my question to you is whether you've been to Ghana and how did you experience Ghana? And going back to the original question as well, whether you think African privilege comes to play in the courthouses of the USA. Feel free to raise your hand if you have a question, and after the judge speaks, you will be called.
Thank you very much. Let me just again compliment all of these extraordinary panelists and our moderator, Ambassador. And I want to particularly acknowledge Perez for the film. I did get a chance to see it. We've had dialogue here in the Seattle area about it, and thank you for that work in particular. There are a number of comments that I would make, so if I run out of time, I want to make sure I say this. We have more in common than we realize. Number two, if you know yourself, then it's easier to accept others. So that's where I'm coming from. It's a spiritually based analysis, but it is really, really important for us to realize that all of us are just extraordinary people. Again, we might have been born in, reared in different zip codes, but it really doesn't matter. We are incredible people. As it pertains to the courtroom, the culture that exists in society also carries itself into the courtroom, so that individuals who are probation workers, and I know that my son is on the line, and Dr. Spearman and some other social workers, it doesn't matter. The culture will get to you and it will tell you how to view certain people. So the judicial officers who have been reared in this culture have the idea that some immigrants are harder working people than the individuals who were born and reared here. The individuals sometimes in the justice system feel like the Africans who were reared in America, they're African Americans, have had every opportunity to do well. And the fact that they end up in the system shows that it wasn't the system's fault, it was the individual's fault. So when it comes to the immigrant population, some of the judges will say that the immigrant, of course, has a better story, has a more compelling story. There's more of a reason for this person to have made a certain decision. There are cultural variables in each group. There are some African Americans who, because of their background, have more of a propensity to make certain choices. And it's the same thing with the immigrant population. So if we begin to look at people as people, this whole artificial notion of privilege goes away. So the short answer is yes, to the same degree that privilege exists, quote unquote, in other venues, it does exist in the courthouse. My son from Ghana is on the line. I want to give a shout out to him. I won't call his name, but Eric, you know who you are. And then I want to acknowledge his wonderful wife, my daughter, and my grandchildren. So through them, I have been physically, have not been to the continent. I don't feel any less Black because I haven't been. I don't know what that noise is. Okay.
Can we all turn off mics, and that should help?
Okay. So, so I have not had the experience of physically being in Ghana, but I think that it will happen in the future. I don't apologize for that. I think Ghana is a wonderful country, and when I get there, I'm going to be home. When I get to any of the countries in Africa, I will be home. because I do have family members also from Cameroon as well as Nigeria. So that's my take. I think this is a wonderful conversation. I want to thank Dr. Spearman for her role in getting me involved in this. And I think it was because of her that I ended up adopting my son. So that's where we are.
Thank you very much, Judge McCullough, and you are invited anytime to be our guest in Ghana. The HACSA Summit 2022 is already in the planning, and we hope to see you there, and many of you who have joined today. I think we have a question.
Yes, we have several. We'll go Mark, then Victor, then Eric.
Hi, Mark Ruffin here. I have a couple questions that I wrote down. Well, how can we begin to help each other? We've all been victimized by the same images we don't control. And how can we begin right now? Because we're under siege. When you look at it everywhere in every community, our people are still being victimized. So how do we begin?
Thank you. Can we take the 3 questions and then we shall ask the panel to answer them? Again, pick and choose. So who is the next one who would like to ask a question?
Yes, Victor.
Thank you very much. How are you doing, Joanna?
I'm very well. We are running out of time. We have 5 minutes to end this webinar.
All right. I don't have a question, but I have a comment to make. The title of this session is Reuniting the Diaspora. But unfortunately, I think we've spent a lot of time talking about the things that we find that differentiates us. Which I suppose you need to know what differentiates us before you can begin to articulate things that we can do to reunite us. I want to make a recommendation. There's a book that I read back in the early 1900s. It was written by Philip Wamba. Unfortunately, he died rather young. The title of the book is called Kinship. And it's really a story about his life. His mother was an African American. His father was a man from Congo. And it talks about the struggles that we've articulated over here between the two families and how they worked out and basically reunited. So if we're seeking a way to reunite, I would suggest that you find this book. Is still available. It's called Kinship. The author is Felipe Wamba, W-A-M-B-A. He's a journalist. He was a journalist who was killed rather young, and I think it would be a good book for all of us to read and begin to look at how we develop action items that would bring us together to move forward.
Thank you. It's on the screen, so you can go to chat and click, and you find it on Amazon. What's our last question, please?
I'm Eric Ajiman. I really, my last question goes to mainly Dale regarding the campus issues. So I've been experiencing this issue about like folks getting upset about having scholarship both at my master's level and my PhD level. And so the statement I've been receiving is that I have taken the spot of African Americans. I know that I get the support from my father, Judge Leroy, and I'll get his feedback at home, but I really want to hear from Dale, how can I handle situations like this?
So Dale, the question is to you.
Right, and I don't think that there's necessarily you have taken a spot. And if people say that, especially, are you going into the PhD, Eric?
I'm already in the PhD.
Okay, so the PhD programs are so personal that there's no such thing as taking a spot from someone else. You know, professors choose who they want to work with, and that's really about how your workflow is going to go, more so than it is about whether you're African or African American. So if someone comes to you with that, that's an inappropriate comment, and you can just tell them that. It's not about my being African, it's about the work that I'm doing that the professor also is interested in. You know, that's your answer for that question.
May I comment?
There's stuff to talk about in terms of that, but that's your basic answer.
May I comment on that just briefly?
Yes, please. Yes,
This is
please.
not to, one of the tricks that we have been exposed to is telling everybody that there are X number of spots.
Absolutely
And
right.
we have to compete for the same number of spots. In other words, you have to divide your 1/100th of a share between all. We don't have to accept that. What we need to remind people of is the cake should be bigger, or the plate should be bigger, the serving should be bigger. So we should not allow anyone to pit us against each other, assuming that they can define what is the limit of the offering. The offering ought to be enough to include everyone who needs to, who wants to get that education, and that means all of the people from the diaspora.
Judge, that I appreciate your comment that it ought to be bigger, but that's not how this works right now. It's not bigger. And so if someone is taking him to task, he needs to be able to answer that it's not about his being African. No. It's not about his being African, but about the kind of work that he's doing, or the subject matter that's part of the reason he's chosen. Yes, the pie should be bigger, but yes, we do have quotas on who's being taken. At this level, yes, they do.
I appreciate that. I'm just saying the larger conversation needs to be had in addition to the individual conversation. The larger conversation.
Very good points there. I wanted to make a point of my own, that the brainwashing also happened in Africa. We have the colonial brainwashing, and I think the difference between the two populations is that we were always in the majority, whereas the African Americans were not. But there are a lot of mindsets which need to be changed, and we would need to go forward together to value ourselves more and to be reunited, because that is really the message of this webinar, which unfortunately has to come to an end, but I think the conversation will continue, and we'll try and deal with this topic again in the future. So last words, unity of struggle, that is something which really resonated with me. That's why we're here today, to unite the diaspora. This is an act of reunification, and this act shouldn't end here in this meeting. We hope you will go out there and take the messages out there, and also bring other people into the fold, and connect with each other in your various networks. And much as we want everyone to join the HACSA Sankofa Network, we also understand that there are other networks out there which need this kind of interaction to reunite us. So we are supportive of all that, and we look forward to continuing this discussion in the future with all of you. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, panel, for your passion and your dedication to this topic. And please sign up to be a member, and let's have a special membership space where we can continue these conversations amongst each other. So they can take all different forms.